Okay, so chapter 3 of our Read Aloud book. This is still coming from Soup. This chapter is called Rope. And here's the picture. I imagine that's Soup, but I could be wrong. I'll say this for Soup. He almost always had some rope when rope was called for. It was all it was a gray length of rotten clothesline that his mother or mine no longer trusted to hoist and wave the family linens, but our rule was that we never called it a clothesline. It was rope. We'd tie 4 or 5 feet of it on the end of a crooked old twig to make a whip. With a bit of luck, you'd snap it and make a crack of a sound, and some white cotton tufts would float into the air. Soup was pretty good at snapping other people, especially girls. Then he'd be the lion tamer and I'd be the lion. I never got to be the lion tamer too often. If we had enough rope, we'd make a lasso. It was never called a lariat, always a lasso. And it was both noun and verb. You could lasso a kid with a lasso. But that was rare as accuracy. Everything and everyone usually got away free. Soup's favorite pastime was to tie somebody up. And this is how he always did it. He'd let me tie him up first. Then he'd turn free in no time at all. But when Soup tied me up, I was usually tied up for most of the afternoon. And when he was sure I was a securely troussed up captive, the torture began. These tortures were much too hideous to talk about, especially to those of faint hearts. The first torture was giving somebody who was tied up a pink belly. This consisted of a few dozen gentle slaps where your shirt was pulled up. Unbearable. That was if the victim was tied to a tree. If there wasn't any rope and there were 4 captors, the captive was spread-eagled in the air and dropped onto the ground several times from a height of up to 6 inches. This was called giving him the bumps. Or you could rub your knuckles in his hair real fast, and that was a Dutch rub. We used to call it a noogie when I was a kid. Everybody's favorite torture was to give a straw mouth. To do this, you take 2 hefty seeded hay straws and cross them into an X. As soon as the victim bites down on the cross, you pull the straws so that all the seeds come out in his mouth, blood-curdling. Soup's worst idea was when he put a blindfold over your eyes. There was something about just not being able to see that made each torture more unbearable than it really was. Then you never knew what Soup was going to do to you. The fact that he never could think of anything very painful was beside the point. The blindfold was pain enough. Another one of Soup's torture tests was an Indian burn. This inhumanity was only possible if there was a length of rope left over after the victim was bound to a tree and 2 torturers. A small piece of rope was pulled back and forth across a naked arm or leg. Indian burns usually produced little heat on the limb of the torture captive, but on a hot July day, the Indian usually worked up quite a lather. If there were 2 Indians, it also burned their hands as well, as there was little or no coordination when 2 Indians were yanking and counter-yanking. Sooner or later, I could always work free when Soup rode off to, quote, rustle more cattle, and before he returned to the hideout. But there was another kid who lived near us who was the meanest, bloodthirstiest redskin that ever held anybody captive. And her name was Janice Riker. She was the biggest and strongest and meanest kid that the world ever knew. She had a mop of thick, wiry black hair and beady black eyes. She had the body of a hunchback, bow-legged ape and the brain power of a fully ripened bean. Janice was a 12-year-old giant at the time when most of us were 9 or 10. At school, she was a year behind me and 2 years behind Soup. Miss Kelly was rarely impressed with her sums or her spelling. But as a mistress of torture, Janice was a real prodigy. When Janice Riker tied you to a tree, you knew you were tied for sure. Your hands went purple in 10 seconds. Her knots were braided triumphs that took more rope than the loop around your body. And the one thing you'd have to say for Janice, she never forgot to put rope around your neck. Tight. When the knots were all secure, Janice produced the dirtiest hanky in town, which was used as a blindfold if you were lucky, and if you were unlucky, as a gag. But seeing as Janice was such a perfectionist, she was usually willing to make a minor sacrifice for her torturous art. She'd kick off a shoe and use one of her smelly old stockings. Janice Riker sure had style. And if that wasn't enough, then came torture. Janice started things by stuffing a bug up your nose. The bug didn't go for the idea any more than the nose did, and usually made its merciful escape. But by then, Janice was just warming up to her trade. She'd yank down your britches and tell you she'd caught a hornet. That happened to me once, only Janice wasn't faking. She really did have my britches down, and she really did have an honest-to-goodness hornet. A real mad one. Janice let me see it by lifting her stocking up over one of my eyes. That was when Soup and Cubby came along. Janice Riker was the only person in the world that Soup was afraid of, except for Miss Kelly, of course. But as for Soup's old dog Cubby, he wasn't afraid of living or dead. Cubby was a mean, one-eyed coonhound. Nights when the moon was full, you'd hear Cubby up on the ridge running after fur, and from a good mile off you'd hear him bugle. It was about the second most beautiful sound anybody ever heard. The first came on the day that Cubby bit into the backside of Janice Riker and made her scream like it was murder. It was a holy note to my ears. Cubby never did take to me a whole lot, but he sure took to Janice, especially after she kicked him in the chops. Nobody with half a brain ever kicks a mean, one-eyed coon dog. I wouldn't kick Cubby if he'd been dead for 3 days, but then Janice was about as smart as a bean. And I wasn't much smarter the day I tied Aunt Carrie up. She let me do it, of course, thinking it was all a game and that she'd be able to turn loose right quick. She was willing. She put her back to one of those small tap maples in the little hollow west of our house, and she let me run around and around with my lasso. Aunt Carrie thought it was a big joke. It was all a big joke, not realizing that I was a graduate of the Janice Riker torture school. Okay, I said, get loose, Aunt Carrie. She wiggled and tugged, yanked and twisted. Then she asked me to cut her loose. I didn't. So then she ordered me to cut her loose. I still didn't. Aunt Carrie then promised me a present. I would get a good sound thrashing if she were not set free this instant. She would give it to me herself. How? I asked her, laughing. This was a mistake. I'd gone beyond the point of no return, and Aunt Carrie had a temper of a wet cat. I began to wonder how I'd ever untie Aunt Carrie without getting thrashed. So I told her how sorry I was and that it was all in fun. To prove my good faith, I started working on the ropes. She quieted down some, and a bit of red drained out of her cheeks. But it was a funny thing about those knots. I remember tying them as tight as I could. All of Aunt Carrie's struggling must have cinched them up even snugger. The knot seemed to be much smaller now, and it was hard to tell where one loop locked into the next. I was actually doing my best to untie the rope, but not fast enough for Aunt Carrie. She figured she was being put upon, so she started struggling again, which really didn't help loosen those knots that seemed to get more snug with each of her spasms. Crash! It started to thunder. The skies were getting darker and darker as the knot seemed to shrink up tighter and tighter. Aunt Carrie started to panic. She was as scared of thunderstorms as Janice was of Cubby. Even in the house, she'd cover her eyes with a dry cloth during an electric storm and put rubbers on her feet. Run to the house and get a kitchen knife, Aunt Carrie screamed at me, her little voice almost lost in the wind. This I did, and the rain was really coming down so hard I was soaked by the time I made it to the kitchen door. I got a knife, a dull one, and hurried out into the storm. The air was white with water, and the thunder was crashing down like old Ned had a headache and there wasn't any Anison. Good thing we're under a tree, Aunt Carrie, I said as I sawed at the knots with little or no progress. I was taking pains to destroy as little of my lasso as possible. Aunt Carrie had her eyes shut and was yelling bloody murder. She was now totally out of control, but somehow I heard her remark that during a thunderstorm, under a tree was the worst place to be, which it is. A big bolt hit nearby, and Aunt Carrie charged like a struck boar. The lasso snapped and her hands were free. That's when she made a slight error. She started to run forward, forgetting that her ankles were still roped to the tree. Aunt Carrie landed face down in a somewhat muddy spot. Whether I needed it or not, as soon as we got back to the house, Aunt Carrie gave me a good, sound thrashing. I tried to explain that if Janice Riker held her captive, things would have been far worse. It didn't do any good. And that's the end of chapter 3.